always interesting going up after Charles. He concludes usually with a very provocative thought, and he did again this time. I think we can recognize that over time, national park policy has evolved. Most parks were established in areas that had hunter-gatherer land use at the time. There was very utilitarian management in national parks immediately after they were established, usually to build up tourism. There was a fair bit of logging and mining in many of the Canadian national parks. Starting about the 50s, we went into a long period of what I guess we would call natural regulation management, which was largely hands-off and just see how the ecosystem evolved. More recently, we've been moving to a more ecological basis in Canada's national parks called ecological integrity. That's defined under Canada's National Park Act as ecological integrity means, with respect to a park, a condition that is determined to be characteristic of its natural region and is likely to persist, including abiotic components and the composition and abundance of native species and biological communities, rates of change, and their supporting processes. And this would include human beings and all processes interacting over the last few hundred years that created the natural regions that we have today. And this is the first priority for Canada's national park management, and it moves us away from what I would call a natural regulation period, more into a period of ecological restoration that does not exclude humans. Banff National Park was Canada's first national park. It's one of Canada's most developed national parks, one of the more developed national parks in the world, and it's also a very beautiful national park. I'm going to talk about 4 issues that, with relevance to Charles' work, that help us refine management over time by understanding long-term ecosystem states and processes. First, let's look briefly at lightning fire. As Charles has well pointed out, lightning fire is very rare on the east slope of the Canadian Rockies, and our fire management program today is based largely on anthropogenic burning. We burn 15 square kilometers per year in Banff National Park, or more by the requirements of the park plan, and a lot of that is done with aerial ignition. I think there's more work to be done in terms of integrating our program with traditional land use and traditional knowledge, but the basics of the program is understanding the anthropogenic regime to maintain long-term fire regimes. A more complex example, and one that's faced in national parks and wilderness areas all up and down the west slopes or the Rocky Mountains, is managing aspen. Aspen is a good ecological indicator. It's very rare. It has high biodiversity in aspen communities, and it's very long-lived, and we're very concerned that we might be losing some aspen clones over time. And it's a situation where it's not a simple solution. In Banff National Park, we have high herbivory rates due to elk from 1940 onwards, and we felt that by prescribed burning we could rejuvenate aspen by perhaps swamping the effects of elk herbivory. So we did some prescribed burning starting in the early 1980s, and we did get some aspen regeneration. There are 4 saplings in that cage there. So we called down to Yellowstone and other places, Jackson Hole, that were also facing similar issues. They suggested, well, what you should do is perhaps burn larger areas. Of course, this is music to the ears of your fire crews. They love to burn large areas. So we burnt some major areas in Banff National Park, 1,000 to 2,000 hectare blocks. Again, however, though, we found that when you have elk densities of 2 to 4 elk per square kilometer, maybe more in some cases, aspen does not regenerate. And it was about this time that we started to phone Charles Kay and say, listen, maybe there's some alternative interpretations about the long-term Western North American environment. So moving with an ecological integrity model, we looked at using a landscape or level trophic model, ecological model, looking at traditional human use and current human use as being very important key drivers in the system. Predators such as wolves and bears, cougars being very important. Herbivores such as elk and mountain pine beetle, which I'll discuss in a minute. And then the mountain, particularly the montane landscape, the valley bottom landscape around Banff, with key ecological processes being human effects on wildlife behavior, displacement, habituation, migration, quarter use, and also direct mortality, hunting, roads, habituated individuals, and then the trophic interaction between the various layers. And of course, in terms of elk management, we were very interested in what the combined effect of perhaps humans, wolves, and grizzly bears and cougars interacting might be on elk densities. So when wolves recolonized the Bow Valley in the mid-1980s, it was very interesting to see how it all unfolded. And it turned out that we had wolves to the left of us, wolves to the right of us, and we were stuck in the middle with about 500 elk trying to get away from the wolves in Banff Townsite in the center. Now this gets you thinking when this happens. And you've also got a lot of public attention when kids are being stomped in people's backyards, tourists are being chased back into their cars. And this is a phenomenon going on across Western North America as predators recolonize landscapes, and we recognize that the herbivores have a different relationship with us than they did historically. Next slide, if you can get it. This one's not, oh, there we go. And I think we can see that historically, these valley bottoms and the Rocky Mountains were lightly used by humans so that the trails, valley bottom trails, could be used by carnivores. They were also frequently burned, as Charles pointed out. And today, the valley bottom quarters in the mountains are heavily used by humans and automobiles. And that elk there on the bottom right, he's got good habitat, and he's also being protected from predators while he's sitting on that roadside. Again, the landscape has totally changed from its historical pattern and process. In Banff, this involved us working with the public, trying to get through understanding this issue, and then intensive management to remove the elk out of the town through relocation. We had to quarantine elk before we relocated them. We reduced the herds dramatically in the core area. The wolves and predators did the job away from the town. And today we manage the elk that try to escape into town to get away from the predators by moving them back with herding dogs, sheep dogs, and pushing them back out to the wolves. And this fella here that's running with these dogs here, he can tell you on any given day whether there's wolves out in the wilds where he's pushing those out, because he just sees it right now. And our elk density has declined down from about 5 elk per square kilometer down to less than 1 elk per square kilometer in most of the montane range. And our prescribed burn program is now starting to restore Aspen to heights greater than 2 meters for the first time in nearly 50, 60 years. Next issue I want to discuss briefly is mountain pine beetle management. This is a major herbivore in the national parks these days, all through Western North America. And it could be argued that it's a native species. For sure it's a native species, but it's living in habitats that are probably precedent. The density of pine species across the landscape, ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, as we all know, is much denser than it ever was historically. So we have a condition that was probably human-caused on the east slopes where we had open habitats. Today we have dense landscapes of mountain pine beetle. So in our case, working with mountain pine beetle, we're trying to work with our neighbors, recognizing that on the east boundary of the park, these are conditions that are outside the long-term range of variability, and we're using intensive management that involves fair home baiting, spot cutting, green attack cutting, thinning to remove mountain pine beetle attack trees on a buffer zone of about 10 kilometers wide up and down the east boundary of Banff National Park. In the far back of the bottom picture there, we have an area where just prescribed fire and beetles are allowed to interact, and we don't do intensive management in the core of the park or further west. Final issue I want to discuss is along the park boundary areas, and this has become very difficult. This is a core area for mountain pine beetle management, prescribed burning in Banff National Park. This is the gateway community of Canmore with the park boundary marked there, and those are prescribed burns quite a ways into the backcountry of the park, shown with a zoom camera lens. But managing in close to the park boundary is very problematic. So probably the most famous or infamous example of what's happened on park boundary areas was at Bandelier National Monument, and many of us in the fire business have made a pilgrimage down to Los Alamos to have a look at a real international event in terms of park community interaction along the boundaries. And it's obviously with $200 million spent there, and the human costs, and with modern media and interaction, our society, an event like this really impacts us directly too. So we looked at Los Alamos and other locations, and we felt the best way to approach this problem is to work from the edge of the communities backwards, and that's what most wildlife urban interface programs are doing these days. So we had a small fuel break we'd already built in the park. We then began to do a lot of work with the province of Alberta and the community of Canmore to put intensive mechanical fuel breaks around their community. And then we put large blocks of shaded fuel breaks just inside the national park boundary in Banff. Followed by some prescribed burning and again mechanical thinning along the power line, along the highway. And then this was the core zone which we would use fire in after we had built the buffers around, based right up against the edge of the communities. This is sort of the fuel break that was being built along Banff's Park east boundary. Several hundred loads of logs were removed out of this area. It's about 3 kilometers wide. We need to spend more time looking at forest structure and traditional land use and reconstructing these forests if we're going to use machinery, but I think the principle is generally good. And as this turned out, the burning started in the spring of 2003. We had a very wet spring, not much burning happened, but then we had the driest summer in 50 years, followed that. That's the fire as it took off in the middle of the summer, took a run at that fuel break, and the fuel break held, or I wouldn't be standing here. In conclusion, knowledge of long-term ecosystem states and processes is essential for current adaptive management processes. There's major changes in the landscape between the time that First Nations used it and the conditions we face today as we try to manage the national parks. But I think with good science combined with traditional knowledge and long-term understanding of the ecosystem, pragmatic use of technology, that we can work with people to make good solutions. And these kids that are watching the fire in Canmore, we have much more political support from them than the folks in Los Alamos. So I think we can work to new solutions and bring it to conclusion.